Good evening and thanks for joining once again. Dr. Biju, who works in the Crofts Memorial Hospital, which is near the Bhutan border, he wanted to do a double J stenting. But then this patient had a fairly elevated creatinine, which means that there may be some difficulty in doing the stenting. So that is the reason why we offered to help by using Zoom software. So all we need is one computer and a cell phone. And we were using the camera and the cell phone and screen share facility there to supervise what is happening. And the pictures are fairly good enough so that we can guide from here. And going on to today's topic, we're going to talk about bladder outflow obstruction. And most commonly is due to benign prostatic hyperplasia. Next slide, please. Benign prostatic hyperplasia is almost considered a normal thing in the sense that by the time anybody is 40 years, the prostate starts growing. It's a physiological change which occurs, and it grows normally about by 1 to 1.5 grams every year. So if we have a 40 grams prostate when you're 40 years old, when you reach 50 years, it'll become about 50 grams or 55 grams prostate. And most of them, once it causes significant obstruction, they'll have symptoms. And nowadays, we are having more and more of people with symptomatic prostate disease because the life expectancy is increasing over the years. So there are more people who may have symptoms. And as the diagram shows here, it has two components in the prostate. It is glandular tissue and also muscular tissue. And these muscular tissues have alpha receptors which control them. And then it is encased in what we call a stroma. So it has glands which increase over the years. Also, there is muscles which contract and it can cause a block. But then the important thing is that it is not the size which determines how much block is there. And I think we already discussed in the first lecture about the obstructive symptoms which occurs due to prostate disease. So normally we need to generate about 60 centimeters of water pressure in the bladder to pass urine. And if there is a block or obstruction, then it takes a much larger force, 70 centimeters or 80 centimeters or 90 centimeters to start voiding. So one of the first things which patients will notice is that they have hesitancy. When they go to the washroom, they are not able to immediately pass urine. It takes a little while. And that may be the only symptom for a long time, because once they start passing, the flow is good and everything else will be okay. And then the next stage, with the further obstruction, what happens is that the stream becomes thinner. This is because they cannot produce enough force, or the bladder muscle cannot contract enough to them to continuously pass urine as they were used to earlier. Then it goes to a stage of what we call intermittency. Here what happens is that the flow rate is not continuous, because say, imagine you're walking in a railway station or platform carrying a heavy suitcase. If it is a light suitcase, you'll keep walking continuously without any problem. But when the suitcase is heavy, you would keep it down, rest for a while, and then start walking again. Or if you're walking fast, you'll slow down in between. Once you gather a little bit of strength, then you'll start walking. So this is the same thing which happens with the urinary stream. So you start with hesitancy, then the stream becomes poor, then we go into the stage of intermittency, where when the force keeps decreasing, it is going in a waveform. And then later on, it can go into what we call incomplete voiding. Once they pass urine, then they will not be able to continue. So they don't empty completely. This makes them go on to the next stage where they have the irritative voiding symptoms. Because if they can't empty completely, what happens is that the effective volume is less. Say, for example, if we take somebody who has effective volume of the bladder about 400 ml, and if they pass 400 ml and if they produce 100 ml per hour, by the time they become full, it'll be 4 hours. But then if they're able to empty only 300 ml and 100 ml is left behind, in another 3 hours, they will reach 400 ml of the full bladder. So effectively, the frequency keeps increasing. And this is quite prominent in the daytime. Because you're awake and you have the sensation, you like to use the washroom frequently. Later on, it can go into nocturia. Even in the night, you might have to develop to get up many times to pass urine. And ultimately, it can go into urgency because the effective capacity is less and you keep on wanting to pass frequently. Later on, they can have other symptoms because normally our bladder has some bacteria. And the doubling time of bacteria is about 20 minutes. In other words, every 20 minutes, the number doubles. So if we start with 10 bacteria, 20 minutes later, it'll be 20, and another 20 minutes later, 40, 80, and so on. But then only when it reaches a level of 100,000 or 1 lakh bacteria per ml, it causes significant infection. But generally, since we are able to void, we don't reach the stage. But then if there is significant residual urine, post-void residue, then you'll have an infection. Then the infection and also the increased blood flow because the prostate gland is expanding can cause hematuria. So generally, the finding is that 60% of the obstruction is due to anatomical, or in other words, because the urinary passage, the prostate gland is there, keeps growing slowly and causing obstruction. And 40% of the obstruction is dynamic because it's due to the contraction of the muscles and epithelial tissue or fibrotic tissue which is around it. So both contribute, and how much they contribute is varying from person to person. Sometimes what happens is that now the lot of research has gone on during the recent times. But the basic finding is that a lot of metabolic syndromes, now they contribute to these lower urinary tract symptoms. And many of them cause inflammation, like even diseases like diabetes, obesity, and dyslipidemia. They all cause inflammation in the tissues. And one of the problems with inflammation is that it causes edema, and it is intermittent. So you might have intermittent symptoms, which might get relieved by itself if the symptoms are due to inflammatory causes. Right. So what do you do when we have symptoms or lower urinary tract symptoms, which we described? So one of the common thing which people do as if they want to record it is the uroflowmetry, which is shown in the slide here. And normal curve is a bell-shaped curve. So you start passing, then the amount goes and flow rate increases, then slowly starts coming down. With the obstruction, the pattern changes so that you don't have enough maximum flow rate. And also it takes a longer time to complete voiding. And then you also do PSA to make sure that there is no malignancy. We're worried about prostate cancers, so which is which is causing the problem. So what we do is we do a PSA. And now recently, because there's a lot of research indicated inflammation, we also do C-reactive protein. Elevated C-reactive protein indicates inflammation. So these are the tests we do to find out when you're evaluating BPH. And the renal function is important because if already creatinine started increasing, then we need immediate treatment. And a word about PSA and passing. This is one of the most widely used tumor markers in the world. And in fact, a lot of places, many of the Western countries, they routinely do it for screening. And they offer radical prostate surgery fairly often. But then you need to realize that PSA is only prostate specific. In other words, it's produced from prostate. But elevated level need not always indicate malignancy. There are many, many other conditions which can lead to elevated PSA. So if suddenly you do a PSA and find that it is high, there's nothing to worry. But you need to know that the normal value is 0 to 4 nanograms, and 4 to 10 is sort of borderline. And you need to start investigating. And one of the investigations is you just repeat it and see if it comes down. And that happens if the level is more than 10. So I think in the second series of lecture, we talked quite a bit about cystometrogram or bladder pressure studies. This is one of the most important investigations you can do, because we said the size does not really indicate obstruction, because if the component of, we said only 60% is anatomical obstruction. The rest of it is not anatomical. It is because of the muscle contraction, which and also the tightness of the capsule around the prostate. So if you know what contributes it, if there is a small gland and significant obstruction, if you do a bladder pressure studies, then it might indicate that it's better to start alpha blockers like tamsulosin rather than finasteride, which reduces the size of the gland. So this will sort of intelligently help you to treat the thing. And if elevated C-reactive protein is there, then you can even use drugs like metformin to treat it. So this gives a way of intelligent analysis and treatment of outlet obstruction. So how we do the tests, we don't need all this expensive equipment. All we need is 2 infant feeding tubes, which goes into the bladder. So one fills the bladder, one measures the pressure. And then we push in the bladder. It's not the ideal way of doing it, but then it gives a good idea of what is really happening. So the important thing is you need to be able to understand what is happening. And we are interested in the detrusor pressure or the bladder pressure, not the total pressure that we are measuring. And the pressure that the infant feeding tube, which is measuring, is actually the sum of the pressure which is caused by the contraction of the bladder muscle and also the abdominal tissue. So if you cough, there is a sudden increase in pressure which goes up and down. Then if you're talking, the pressure goes up. If the patient is holding the breath or contracting the abdominal muscles, you will be able to know. So you need to stand next to the patient and observe what is happening, so that you remove all these abnormal readings and concentrate only on the changes which occur because of the contraction of the bladder muscles. So this will give a very good idea of what is happening and whether the patient responds, how the patient response would be with treatment. Okay, so how we do is first you have to remember a few things. One, you start asking the patient to empty the bladder. This is because we need to know whether they have post-void residue and what is the actual volume. And basically in BPH, we're interested in finding out the maximum voiding pressure. If you want more details, you can go back into the recording of the previous lectures which are available. The second lecture in rural urology was on how to do a cystometrogram, where you find the details will be there. And here we record generally the resting pressure. Normally is less than 10. And then God has created a bladder muscle in such a way that when it expands, the not like a balloon. It expands without increase in the pressure inside the bladder. And once it starts increasing, then that is the time we start having the sensations of voiding. And then when there is a significant increase, it causes urgency and you can't hold. And then you measure the maximum voiding pressure and also the post-void residue. And it's good to have a sheet, something like that, which is shown there to record what is happening. So this gives the normal findings. So normally the resting pressure is about 10 centimeters and the functional capacity is about 350 to 400 ml. The first sensation or the sensation that there is some urine in the bladder occurs when it's about 150 ml. And you have a desire to void at around 350 ml. And when it reaches about 400 ml, there's generally urgency there. And in the previous lecture, we saw how all these things can be affected by various conditions. But in BPH, everything will be normal except that the voiding pressure will be high. So normal is 60. If it is above 90, we would generally recommend surgery. Between 60 to 90, you can manage with medical treatment. And again, the post-void residue. So normally is less than 30 is not significant. More than 100 is very significant. And the most common abnormality that we detect in doing a CMG is prostatic hypertrophy or the pressure which is high because of obstruction due to BPH. Okay, so then we also do a cystoscopy because as we discussed earlier, the variety of conditions which can give these lower urinary tract symptoms and can mimic exactly BPH. So unless you know what it is, if you offer treatment and treatment might not work. So we need to rule out any strictures, we need to rule out any neurovesical dysfunction, whether there are any stones which cause the problem, whether any tumors. So all these things are necessary before we start thinking about treatment. The growth of prostate rate has increased over the years. So now the current literature says that the growth rate is about 1 to 1.5 grams per year. And quite a bit of it could be due to the recent addition or discussions about inflammation. Because the inflammations and insulin resistance and obesity and all these things, they have been contributing. So that is why that video doesn't even mention the C-reactive protein as a part of the investigations. So now we do that. Otherwise, not much has changed over the years. So one other thing which, when that time people were wondering was that there may not be much of a correlation. Definitely there is no correlation between the symptoms and results of treatment. Then even with the urodynamic finding, they said that it might not correlate so much. But then ultimately, now the recent consensus is that the uroflowmetry, the urodynamic studies or bladder pressure studies is a fairly good indicator of the results of the treatment for the bladder outflow obstruction. Okay. So then what are the various methods which are available? So one, what we call is watchful waiting. But this was given at a time when the treatments had their complications problem. Because until recently, the gold standard of treatment is transurethral resection of prostate. It has about 3% mortality and morbidity. And it can cause significant problems. It can cause retrograde ejaculation. It can cause decreased sexual drive. And then very rarely, it can cause incontinence and so on. And in the immediate post-op period, if people who are not used to doing these procedures, they can't control the bleeding, patients can die because of bleed. And it can, the veins can absorb water and cause hyponatremia and cause symptoms. So considering those symptoms, people said watchful waiting is one strategy, because we don't know how quickly the symptoms will, or quickly the prostate will enlarge and the symptoms will improve. And the other reason is that if it is due to inflammation, we all know that inflammation does settle down. So if there is inflammation and the prostate becomes big and they have symptoms, when the inflammation settles down and the prostate size improves, then the symptoms will go away. But then most of them will end up having some medical treatment rather. And the medical treatment, you need to realize is that it's a temporary measure, because with time, the prostate size will keep increasing. Even if you give finasteride, the rate of increase will decrease, but then it will keep increasing. And similarly, even with the blockers due to alpha blocker, alpha muscle contractions, and if we give alpha blockers, the effect of the treatment also will over the time diminish. So ultimately, medical treatment is to buy time for surgical treatment. But now with improvement in surgical treatment, anesthesia and so on, it is better to offer surgical treatment, and especially rural patients, they need not pay so much on the medicines. And this gives various risk factors for progression, or where we would consider earlier surgical treatment. Like the patient is an older patient, age above 62. And if the prostate is a fairly large one, about 30 cc, or the PSA is high, even though less than 4 is normal, but then the amount of PSA varies with the size of the prostate. And if the symptoms are high, and also the significant post-void residue. So this, the graph on the right shows how these conditions progress with the treatment. So the white line on top is placebo, when there's actually no treatment. Then the green line is when you give finasteride or tamsulosin or combination therapy. And you note that the combination therapy is better, because both medicines, types of groups of medicine, act in different places. Hence, it is good to give a combination. Then alpha blockers, because the thing is, with time, a lot of people develop newer medicines, basically because once the patents expire for one group of medicines, they would like to have the next patent. So they will always come up with medicine which may not be as good as may not have a very significant improvement over the previous one. So if any alpha blockers is actually good enough. So now, only difference is alpha 1A selective or tamsulosin is as good as any of the other alpha blockers which are recently available. So the rule of thumb to go by is that whatever is easily available and less expensive is good enough. So this decreases the prostate tension, or the muscles, or the contraction because of the size. So these are more useful if the size of the gland is very symptomatic and the size of the gland is not very big. Then you start with alpha blocker, and later on you can add a finasteride or the next group of medicine. Okay. Then these are 5-alpha reductase inhibitors. So this acts by decreasing the size of the prostate. So now the currently available medicine is deuteriside. There is no significant difference between finasteride or deuteriside. And because whether it affects the earlier or second stage, ultimately it prevents DHT formation. And now the recent addition to this is metformin, which I said, see now a lot of physiology is going on about the inflammation which occurs in the prostate, which contributes to the increase over the years. At least the size, as I said, 2 decades ago, it increased only about 0.6 grams per year. Now it has gone up to 1 to 1.5 grams. And quite a significant contribution is because of the insulin resistance and metabolic disease. And metformin is one drug which will help this. And here again, it sort of depends, I mean, it shows the magnitude of benefit of with time, symptom, and depending on what type of medicines are useful. So the benefit magnitude is there, and time also is there. So as time goes, what you need to realize is that the benefit which you get from the medicines will become progressively less, and you'll reach a point where surgical treatment is necessary. Okay, and what are the contraindications to medical treatment? So if the patient has acute painful retention, maybe you can give a trial avoid. If it is not due to a small stone, then it is very likely that the patient will have another episode of retention and would require surgical treatment. And any time you need to understand that, especially in rural areas, emergency surgeries are more difficult than elective. So it's as far as possible, it is better to do elective surgical procedures. So any acute painful retention would need surgical treatment. And again, if the bladder is palpable and there is a very significant post-void residue, then the complications keep becoming higher. Because one of the worrying complications is that there is urinary tract infection. Even if it doesn't cause significant infection with 100,000 bacteria per ml, even a little bit of infection is problematic because it can infect the post-operative tissues. And wound healing is delayed, and the bacteria can get into the bloodstream and cause septicemia, and a lot of problems are there which are related to infection. So as much as possible, we need not, we should not have infection, and if there is significant post-void residue, the earlier treatment you offer, the better it is. And of course, if renal insufficiency is started, then it's you should not wait. You should offer immediate treatment. And then if there is recurrent hematuria, if there are stones and other things which need treatment at the same time, then we offer surgical treatment immediately. Otherwise, we do a CMG and cystoscopy or cystometrogram, and if the pressures are above 90, we would advise them surgical treatment is better. And if it is between 60 to 90, till they want surgical treatment, they are happy to go ahead and have a medical treatment. Okay, so this is the transurethral resection was considered the gold standard for a long time. And despite being the gold standard, it definitely had a little bit of mortality and morbidity. It used to be around 3%, and now it has come down to 0.2%. As various things improved, because the management, electrolyte management, and the ICU treatment, and all those things became better. And of course, when we were students, any prostate, we had a sleepless night because we don't know when they'll go into bleeding and clot rejection, which is fairly common. And we never used to do a prostate surgery if we don't have a unit of blood as a reserve. And TUR syndrome due to hyponatremia used to be fairly common. In fact, I still remember vividly the first patient when he entered when we started working in urology ward. There was a patient who was standing on the bed totally naked and preaching to the rest of the ward. And there was a big crowd there. And all this due to hyponatremia, which causes this problem. And sometimes glycine can even cause transient blindness. So this is a surgery which had some complications. But of course, compared to open surgery, it is far better because I did study of the open prostate surgery they did in various mission hospitals in remote areas. And I found it had a mortality of almost 17%, which is very, very high. about 1 out of 5 person dying after surgery is very significant. So this is a far better outcome compared to that. So, but still, in some places, if they don't have facilities for transurethral surgeries, you might consider doing open surgeries. And if other coexisting conditions or ankylosis which prevent proper positioning and so on, or if there is severe urethral strictures where you can't pass a resectoscope, then people do open surgeries. But otherwise, open surgeries, as far as possible, I would not advise, because even in good hands, it is a blind procedure and can cause significant bleeding, and especially in a remote area. If there is a significant bleeding, it's difficult to take care of it. 2 days ago, I was having a look at the video. They said the latest treatment available is use of laser prostatectomy. And it took almost 2.5 hours for them to do a fairly large prostate surgery. And I remember looking at the video, the pictures are almost exactly the same as that what we did for some of the patients in Northeast India. The patients are fairly short and small. So they have a urethra which is small. So, but the smallest resectoscope that we have for either using TURP or transurethral vaporization is 25 French. If the prostate size is smaller than that, what do we do? So what we did was we used a regular cystoscope and what we call Bugbee electrode. And using the Bugbee, we were able to slowly vaporize the prostate tissue. And it's exactly the same, the pictures are exactly the same as what we're doing for laser treatment. The laser treatment is at least 25 to 30 times more expensive than this, because this you need just a cystoscope and ordinary electrocautery machine. So many of these things, we shifted to doing transurethral vaporization of prostate almost 1 or 2 decades ago, because it causes hardly any bleeding and vision is not impaired, and hyponatremia and the dilutional hyponatremia and all those complications are not there. The advantage is that you don't need to have blood. You can do safe surgery. You can teach others to do safe surgery. So we were shifted to that. And it is you don't need any special equipment. You need exactly the same equipment that is necessary for the regular TURP. But only thing is we use a much higher wattage. Normal setting for TURP uses 150 watts for cutting current. Here we use, ideally you should use about 500 watts. But most of the machines do not have 500 watts. So 400 watts is sufficient. And it literally vaporizes the prostate and makes it disappear into thin air. The main drawback of this is that you don't get any tissues for biopsy. So what we do is we do a combination therapy where we take a few tissues for resection and the rest we vaporize. But then why are we interested in people working in rural areas? Why are we talking about high-fi surgery like TURP and so on? TURP, I would recommend that if anybody is doing, you need to refer to a properly trained urologist. The reason is that if you're not able to control properly, if you're not able to do properly, it has complications. It has a time limit. You need special techniques to control bleeding. And even if you're used to it, there are chances of hyponatremia because of absorption of glycine or water or whatever irrigating fluid that you're using. So that way, if you do transurethral vaporization, it is easy to learn, and you need not do a complete surgery. Even if you remove half the prostate or one lobe, that should suffice. But even that needs investment in terms of having a resectoscope and so on. But even if you use the cystoscope and the Bugbee electrode and slowly vaporize a little bit of the prostate, that can help quite a bit. And you can wait for the urologist to come and patients will be able to void. So all the things that we are taught, the HIFI urodynamic study is possible. All you need is 2 infant feeding tubes. You need to know how the technique to do it, so that we know which patients to choose for surgery. And if the pressures are more than 90 centimeters of water, you can either, if we have the facility, you can do a transurethral vaporization of prostate. If you're unhappy to do the full thing, even if you vaporize one lobe or half the other lobe, that should suffice. Even if that is also not there, all that investment you need is just a simple laptop cystoscope that we are talking about the last few sessions, where you can use a Bugbee electrode and a higher wattage to burn the prostate tissue and make a passage. Because even if we just increase the passage, that quite dramatically reduces the pressure which are necessary to void. Probably the metformin and how it works might be a difficult thing to explain in a very short time which we have. But basically, as I said, the recent understanding is that quite a bit of the enlargement of the prostate is due to inflammation. And this inflammation is again due to the recent habits, which have increased insulin resistance. So basically, if a patient has symptomatic prostate and has either known as a non-diabetic or has elevated C-reactive protein, giving metformin to them will help. And also in metformin is one of the medicine which is used for treating obesity also. It doesn't cause hypoglycemia. It decreases the amount of glucose in the tissues. And it'll help a little bit. It's not not the only treatment or the sole treatment, but it can be added to medical treatment if necessary. So this is the place the metformin is supposed to act. The finasteride and deutetracetate, they act here at the beginning stage. So this is all involved in converting to dihydrotestosterone. So the recent this thing is the inflammation, the IGF receptor, which the metformin blocks, will aid in decreasing the inflammation and the size of the prostate. See, the retrograde ejaculation is actually a complication of surgery. So what happens is that the sphincter is at the level of the verumontanum. And the veru is where the prostatic ducts open. And the way it opens is that it opens distally also, that it has to come. So when you're resecting the prostate, if you imagine the prostate, so it goes like this. So there's a verus here, and then there is a depression, and then it goes. So when you resect in this portion which is depressed, the duct which is opening here can turn, and it goes. When there is healing and contraction, it can point backwards. So in the duct, instead of pointing forward, it can point upward or backwards into the bladder. That causes what is called a retrograde ejaculation. So when the patient ejaculates, so the semen, instead of coming down, it goes back into the thing. But if you're careful, especially if you know then beforehand the patient has infertility or they want more children, then you need to limit the resection so that you don't resect too much around the veru. Even normally, I would not advise people who are learning to resect too much around the veru, because that's not the area where there is significant obstruction. And because the sphincter is there, in fact, I mean, you can cause more problem by resecting there and causing incontinence rather than having an obstructive symptoms. People will hate you if you give them incontinence instead of obstructive symptoms. Okay, if there is no other question, thanks for joining, and bye. Have a great day.